Are we on air?
I think we're on the air.
We're on the air.
We're on the air.
Amazing. Good afternoon, everybody. It's Kelly and Jordan here from Disrupt. We're here in the lovely city of Toronto. And on the other side of the screen, we have our dear friend, Mark Henick, who is also in Toronto over there. Say hey, Mark.
Hello.
I'm going to give just a 2-minute intro to Mark. So Mark, we met initially, it would have been about 2.5 years ago, I think, or 2 years ago at TED Toronto, because you had spoken in, what, 2013?
2013, yeah.
Yeah, 2013, and delivered your killer TED Talk, no pun intended, why you choose suicide. That was not a good joke.
That was a bad joke.
That was a very bad joke.
We're going to plow through.
Yes. And from there, you were around the TED community, and we got to know each other. Then we ended up sharing stories at a storytelling event, the Raconteurs in Toronto, at the Transac as well. And since we've become wonderful friends, and it's a real treat to have Mark with us today. For those of you that don't know Mark or his work, he's a mental health advocate and speaker. He travels all over, all the time in Canada and the US, and delivers very, very important lectures and workshops on mental health as it relates to our modern schools and workplaces. When he's not doing that, he's frequently in the media, including a recent column on CNN, which is awesome, as well as has a forthcoming book coming out. I'm not sure if that's terribly public knowledge yet, but it's okay.
It is now.
It is now. Has a forthcoming book coming out next year, which is tremendously exciting. And beyond that, what else are you up to these days, Mark?
Well, I also happen to be, in my spare time, National Director of Strategic Initiatives for the Canadian Mental Health Association, Canada's oldest, largest community mental health agency.
Yes, so that too, and is also a father of 2 wonderful boys. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Mark to lead the show. Mark, please make yourself at home. Everyone, if we could get you just to message in and say hi to Mark and give him a warm welcome to our Wednesday webinar, that'd be phenomenal. Take it away, Mark. Thank you again for being here. And as we go, guys, I encourage you to submit questions. And here's the rough framework that we'll use. We'll do about 35 to 45-minute presentation from Mark, during which, Mark, if you want to do any live question and answers, go for it. And then at the end, we'll make sure we set aside some time for a more formal Q&A. Sounds good? Send in yes if it sounds good, and we'll rock it out. If anyone has any special asks as we go, feel free to ask away. Callie's going to be manning the chat. And I'm going to be watching from my phone because I've got to catch a flight to Halifax, Nova Scotia right now. Yeah. So with that, thank you, Mark. Enjoy, guys. You're in wonderful hands. And here we go. Warm welcome from Mark Henick, everybody.
Woo!
Yay!
Thank you. All right. So I'm just, as I wait for control of the system to come over to me, I'd like to tell you thank you for having me today. I'm looking forward to presenting to you a little bit of my knowledge about suicide, but also some of my experience, especially how it pertains to campus and university life. So I'm going to share my screen with you here, and there we go. And I think you should be able to see it. All right, can everybody see my screen? If you can just comment, somebody over there, if you can see my screen. There we go. I think it's coming up now. All right, perfect. So I'll just jump right in. Now, I don't have my second monitor with me, so I won't be able to see your screens once I go full screen. I won't be able to see your questions as they come in. However, I will be keeping an eye on time, and I'd love to have some conversation about these important issues at a little bit closer to the end. So I'll try to keep it to 30 minutes. It might go to 45, we'll see. I definitely won't go beyond that though, because the questions are important. And you may notice me skipping some slides from time to time. I still get really into this, so we'll see. So with that, a little bit of context. My involvement with mental health on campuses is really in many ways, at least partially, where I started doing this kind of work. I started as a mental health advocate in high school, actually, when I was still very much struggling with my own depression and anxiety, really very severe at times, and my own suicide attempts. I started to come out of that, or at least the active attempt phase of my recovery journey in high school, and that happened when I wanted to talk about my own experiences, when I wanted to tell the stories of my suicide attempts, tell the stories of my struggle with the mental health care system, and how the stigma that I experienced every single day was often worse than the symptoms themselves. I mean, the symptoms were bad enough on their own, but the stigma, not being able to tell people about them, not being able to ask for help, was really what impacted me more on some days. So in that initial, those initial year or two, when I spoke up and said that I wanted to speak about these experiences, I was told not to. In high school at the time, my high school principal said no, that we don't talk about suicide in school, especially because it gives people the idea to go out and do it. Now we know, and I knew then, that there's quite a large base of research which shows that that's not the case, that there is a right way and a wrong way to talk about suicide. There's a safe and an unsafe way. There are productive and unproductive ways to talk about suicide. But sharing your experiences, it does not cause suicide. It doesn't give people the idea to go out and do it as though they had never done it before. And I think that that's a common misconception. So we're going to try to break down that misconception among others today. I want to start with where suicide comes from. So we're going to start talking about mental health and about mental health problems and illnesses, because we know that more than 90% of the people who die by suicide have a diagnosable mental illness at the time of their death. What that means is that we're pretty sure that suicides, generally speaking, come from a place of mental illness. Now, however, what you may think that means, or what you may or may not think that means, could be different. So many people resist that what seems to be an empirical fact. So I want to break down a little bit more about what I mean when I say mental health and what I mean when I talk about mental health problems and illnesses. So today's objective is to think about mental health from the perspective of a spectrum rather than just having illness or not. Look a little bit more into the basics of mental health, or the new basics, I should say, which might be a little bit different than what you're accustomed to. And then talking about getting stuck rather than getting sick, because I think that certainly in terms of the psychological process, it's more about stuckness than it is simply about having something wrong with your brain or being broken. You are not broken. And I'd like to be able to get over that, to get through that barrier that makes people think that they are. A little bit about how to watch for suicide and learning about how to encounter it, and then connecting people with the help that they need. So let's start by thinking about mental health. Take a step back from suicide for a minute, because if we only ever talk about suicide and we only ever talk about death and dying and the worst possible outcome of a mental illness, then we're already too late. We're already behind the solution in some ways, already behind the 8 ball. So we need to take a step back and talk about mental health. This is by far the best practice, or the best emerging practice anyway, in most of the most effective suicide prevention strategies at a national, community, or institutional level. One, for example, called the Nuremberg model, another called the zero suicide approach, which really focuses in on treating depression, essentially, recognizing and treating common mental health problems and illnesses like depression and anxiety before, ideally, the person has to struggle with them, because that seems to be the trajectory that's by far the most closely associated with attempted and completed suicide. So let's break down a little bit more about mental health and start doing that by what I call, anyway, a well-being spectrum. Some people think about mental health as being sick or not, that you're either mentally ill or you're not, or you're either depressed or you're not. And that kind of black and white thinking, despite being a characteristic of many mental health problems themselves, just isn't reflective of the reality. In fact, anybody who's had depression or who's felt depressed at some point in their life knows that there are many different degrees of that. Being sad is different from being depressed, of course, but they actually do live in the same house together. They have many common characteristics. So it's not necessarily the emotion itself, it's how that emotion gets implemented, the impact that it has on you and your life.
Hey, Mark.
So in order to explore that a little bit further, we see that the spectrum that I have in front of you here today can slide back and forth. And I just want to pause for a second, because I just heard an audio and it sounded like somebody wanted to jump in.
Real quick, do you mind
Yep.
full screening your display so we can read it a little better?
Do I mind what, my display?
On your slideshow, we're having trouble with reading the text. Do you mind going into mode?
Let me see how I can do that. Is it going full screen for you?
No, we see all your slides along the side. Like whatever you see.
Oh, you do? Okay. I'm not sure why that's happening, so let me do it this way.
There we go. That's
when I go full screen. Yeah, when I go full screen, you're not seeing full screen.
perfect. Okay.
So I will do this instead.
All right, take it away.
Thank you for that. And I apologize if for the, you didn't miss much. You only missed a couple of title slides, so we're good. So then, as you see in front of you, this a bigger version of the mental health or well-being spectrum with our green zone in the middle, and that's the place where we generally feel the best. That's where we feel the most balanced. That's where we're the most productive. Generally, what happens, we know that people move back and forth on this all the time. That's the way your mind and your state of well-being is supposed to work. That little box in the middle, if I was able to go full screen and you were able to see it, you'd see it moving back and forth. To my left, or looking at the spectrum itself on into the teal, blue, purple side, that's the negative experience, or the lowering, turning down, turning off. Things are slowing down. You're turning the dials down when you're sliding down that end of the spectrum. The blue end, as you might imagine, that's where depression lives. And depression, why it seems to be a turning down in many ways, is that many of the faculties, both in your body and in your mind, it's a bit of a misnomer, they become depressed. They turn down. That means they're less productive than they otherwise would be in your baseline. And your baseline is somewhere in your green zone. That's perfectly normal. That's how your mind is supposed to react. And in fact, if you don't slide down into sadness, and we'll talk more about the other side, more up into stress, if you don't slide freely along the spectrum, that's when we start to think there's something wrong, even if you happen to be stuck somewhere in the middle, and otherwise the symptoms aren't super bothersome to you. The fact that you can't move around on it is a problem. So it's the rust, not the speed, that's the issue. So we want to see why you're stuck. Everybody knows what grief feels like, unfortunately, and we know from the research that grief and depression, physiologically, psychologically, socially, are very, very similar. The difference is that with grief, you might plunge down into that far end, especially if it's somebody close, a loved one for you. You might plunge way into the far end of that purple, the worst possible outcome. You might feel terrible. And you see our emojis along the bottom representing the impact that it has on your emotion. So you might go way down in there, but we also know that the large majority of people who grieve recover from that grief. You go through a series of stages. Everybody does it at their own pace. They do it in their own way. But eventually they get back up to normal, whatever their normal is. However, something seems to happen with people who have depression. Even though the symptoms, the experience of both grief and depression are very similar, for some reason people with depression get stuck in that place and they don't come up either as easily, or they slide back down there much easier than would be expected. On the other side, the plus, that's where we see the additive symptoms, where things become more intense, they turn up, you might get more angry or more restless, your heart might beat faster, you might sweat more. That's where everything turns up. And as you might imagine, that's where stress lives, that's where anxiety lives. Stress and anxiety are two different things, of course. Everybody experiences stress, not everybody experiences anxiety. The difference seems to, again, be in that stuckness. It's okay to get stressed. In fact, there's such thing as good stress. It can be motivating. It's what can drive you to get things done, for example. However, we also know that people need to come down from there. That resilience is not about not feeling stressed. Resilience is about how you recover after you're feeling stressed. So in order to bring yourself back into that center zone, back into that green zone, having the skills to do that, either to bring yourself up or bring yourself down as necessary, but then still be perfectly able to slide back up to either end of the spectrum as the situation dictates. And that's really what mental health is. It's that mental flexibility. It's that ability to not get stuck in any one place or another. And essentially, mental health is a state. It's a constantly shifting, evolving state. Your baseline can change depending on your environment and a number of other factors, but it's a state in which people can cope with challenges. It's not a state of not feeling challenged or not being challenged or not suffering. It's not a state of perpetual happiness. The opposite of mental illness, the opposite of depression, rather, isn't happiness. The opposite of depression is thriving. It's being able to cope with challenges, to get sad, but then to get through it and to be able to be happy again, to be able to work productively, to think, feel, and act in ways that actually enhance your life rather than making it more difficult for yourself. And this is what we see all the time, either when people who are on the low end of this spectrum and are feeling depressed, or if they're feeling stress and anxiety up on the other end, or if they're feeling some mixture of both, which is very, very common as well. Or another option, if they're swinging from one end to the other, they're feeling very depressed for a period of time and then very anxious or manic another period of the time. Ideally, we want to, or what we see happen rather when people get in those places is that they spiral, and sometimes their symptoms actually keep them stuck as well. So they're, somebody who is very depressed might keep themselves, for example, in their bedroom in bed for a long period of time. And we know that lack of social interaction makes people more depressed. So the symptom of the depression, being tired, wanting to isolate, withdraw, stay in bed, is actually what's keeping them depressed. And the same is true on the other side as well. If you're extremely irritated, irritable, as many men especially who experience high levels of stress and anxiety, anger and irritability is common in that. And of course, that's often not a socially acceptable emotion, especially when taken to the extreme that anxiety and stress can take it. So that might be isolating as well. If you're constantly you present as a constantly angry person, fewer people will want to reach out to you, and then it makes it very difficult to actually express that anger in a productive way, often keeping you stuck there. So there's many factors that can keep people stuck, and sometimes we ourselves are one of those factors. That stuckness is the idea of being stuck in a pattern. And that's really what it is. You've cycled into this place for a variety of reasons. It might be biological. We'll break down these reasons too. It might be a biological reason. It could be something to do with your physiology, your physiological makeup, and maybe depression or anxiety, schizophrenia, eating disorders, alcoholism, whatever it is. It might be something to do with your genes. It might be genetic. However, we also know that that's only one part of it. That may or may not be part of your individual incarnation of a mental illness, but it might be. So we also know, however, that in addition to the biology, there's also the psychology of it. How we think impacts our brain and our environment. And then the environment that we find ourselves in certainly impacts our mental health as well. So what we look for when people become stuck are the patterns that exhibit in their feelings and in their actions that are counterproductive and that interfere with their own ability to cope and to function well. So to revisit that spectrum again, what we see, again, if the animations were able to work here, they don't, or actually I might be able to make it do a little test here. Let me see. Yeah, there. So when we fall way down onto one of those sides, maybe we're grieving, but then one of those barriers comes up and it keeps us stuck. These biopsychosocial barriers can be a number of different factors. Like I said, they can be biological, they can be psychological rather, or they can be social. When people are stuck way down in the blue, it might be depression, as I've mentioned. It might be also dysthymia, which is when you're not quite into depression, but it just feels like this almost perpetual wet, dark blanket that's always on you, and you can't quite shake it. You're not depressed, but you're just persistent sadness, and you always feel it. Also way on that end is the reason that we're talking today, suicide. When people fall off that end or they stay stuck in a particular place for so long, that's exhausting. It drains the resources that you have available to you. And eventually when those resources become more depleted than they are being refilled, that's where we start to see the risk of suicide. We see this, and one of the reasons that I've developed this model in particular and think that it applies not just to my own experience, to that of others, is that we see this happening on the other side too. So when people are extremely stressed, especially on the far end of the spectrum, we'll do just about anything to not feel that emotion anymore, to be able to get out of that. When we start to feel helpless and hopeless, that suicide then becomes, it seems like a more viable option, even though it's not. It seems like a more viable option the further to either end of the spectrum you come. Also, what we tend to see happen is that because of the impact that it has on your body, your mind, and your social interaction, the further to either end of the spectrum you go, the more limited your vision of the options around you become. the more, and this is a very evolutionary function, that your body, in its interest in self-preservation, will focus in more and more. Some of you might know about the impact that fear, for example, has on the body. Generally, what happens if you're being chased by a bear is that your body will forget everything that is not relevant to getting away from that bear. You will forget to eat, you will forget to pee, your body ignores everything else that isn't immediately necessary to keeping you alive. Other systems will start to shut off. And that's exactly what starts to happen in your mind, even if you're not being chased by a bear, or if your body interprets that you're being chased by a bear, your body and your mind for that matter, then it'll react in similar ways. That fight or flight response, it shuts down your ability to see other options. So when we ask ourselves, or why that person died by suicide and we can't seem to understand it, they had so many options ahead of them. Or if we tell them you have so many more options, it's very likely that they won't see that. And often they can't see that because it's blinded by that rigidity, that calcification that starts to happen as you approach, increasingly as you start to approach either end of that spectrum. The reality is, at least in Canada, and this is true in the United States as well as the United Kingdom, Australia, and elsewhere, that 1 in 5 people will experience a mental illness, a mental health problem this year. Any given year, about 20% of people will experience a mental health problem or illness. Some countries you'll see that goes to 1 in 4 or 1 in 5, sometimes as low as 1 in 3. It depends on what's being counted as a mental health problem or illness. Sometimes substance-related disorders aren't included in this number. Sometimes dementia isn't included in this number, among a couple of others. What we do know, however, is that all told, all included, in Canada and other countries, by the time most people reach the age of 40, a full 50%, 1 in 2, will experience a mental health problem or illness. They may or may not have been diagnosed. They may or may not have gotten help and treatment. Actually, chances are they probably didn't. Most people, only about 1/3 of people actually get help for mental health problems, even though they could all benefit from it. So we know that this is impacting almost everybody. And when you start to include advanced age as well and dementia, virtually everybody, but that the large majority of people aren't getting help. The impact of this, of course, that since suicide does seem to flow from largely untreated mental illness, not exclusively, but the large majority, 800,000 people every year around the world die by suicide, every single year. That's more than murder and war combined, according to the World Health Organization. Far more people are dying by suicide than terrorism, but you hear about terrorism every day. Actually, interesting fact, in the United States, more adults are shot by toddlers than die by terrorism, but we still hear about terrorism every single day. Suicide is a major public health concern that needs to be receiving better attention because we're losing people literally by the thousands every single day. So what can we do about this on college campuses in particular? How can we address this crisis since it's can be extremely complex? We know that every single one of those 800,000 people who died by suicide can be prevented. At least in a theoretical model, every single suicide can be prevented because there is no organic reason anyway that that person should die. You will not die because of depression. You will not die because of anxiety, biologically speaking. However, if left untreated, sociologically and psychologically, it puts you at much higher risk for suicide, and then that could be the risk through which you kill yourself. But on its own, we know that we can treat depression. There are many effective treatments for depression, for anxiety, and the wide variety of other mental health problems and illnesses. In fact, and I'll talk more about this later, recovery is not just possible from all mental health problems and illnesses. Recovery is expected. Recovery quickly when people get the help that they need. So let's talk a little bit more about getting either helping yourself or getting people help for their struggles. We need to do that, we need to understand a little bit about what's causing the struggle. The struggle in this case is that barrier that's keeping people stuck on one end of the spectrum or another, or at any point. Maybe it's a stuckness at a mid-range of some kind, where you're kind of happy, but not quite, you could be better. You know, for everybody's spectrum looks a little bit different, and everybody's stuck point looks a little bit different too. And you may find that it's a tendency to go back to that place more so than a stuckness to always be there. So then how do we address that? What is that barrier? What's that pathway that's been so neurologically reinforced, that cognitive pathway that keeps coming up? There's a number of different reasons. Let's use depression as an example, because it's an easy one, since it's by far one of the most common health problems, not just mental health problems, period. Some of the biological reasons for depression is that biologically it could be just depression. There are neurological markers for depression, and that could be what's causing that person to be stuck. It could be their brain that's keeping them stuck. Now, I'll talk a little bit more about neuroplasticity and how we can change our brain. We do change our brain every day, whether we like it or not. But biologically, it could be simply depression that's keeping that person stuck. However, there's also a number of different reasons. Hypothyroidism, for example, is something that is often misdiagnosed, or it could be thought to be depression, and it's actually hypothyroidism. They share many similar symptoms, certainly in terms of diet and sleep, and overall activity level. We know that there's also a number of other what are traditionally seen as exclusively physical illnesses that are closely associated with depression. Diabetes, for example, heart disease, there's a very strong connection that people who have had a heart attack are at much higher likelihood of having depression, and vice versa. People who have depression are at much higher risk of having a heart attack. Kidney disease, MS, arthritis all seem to be closely associated with depression. The science is in a place where we're not entirely sure why these connections exist, although we do think, again, that it's biopsychosocial, that there's a variety of reasons, physical, mental, and social, that seem to be playing in. Psychologically, there are some of the reasons, some of the bricks in the wall that keep people stuck in depression. Psychologically, it could be depression. You may have learned a depressed way of thinking through certain ineffective or ineffective cognitive processes or coping mechanisms that just don't work. So that's where we talk about keeping ourselves stuck. That's nobody's fault, of course. That's how you've learned, but there very much is a learning component to learning how to be depressed. I've learned how to be very good. I've learned very well how to be depressed, but fortunately, I've also unlearned, and I've learned new strategies as well. There's a very close connection between trauma and most mental illnesses, but depression and anxiety in particular. And we know that people who have not experienced either acute or complex trauma, but have depression anyway, they tend to respond slightly better to medication. But if they have experienced trauma and they have depression or anxiety, they tend to respond better to psychotherapy. Both people respond, there's segments of the population that respond to either one on its own, medication or psychotherapy, but by far the gold standard approach is something called combination therapy, which is both. You take medication in order to help you get out of bed so you can go see your therapist, who's going to help you with the underlying issues. Now, of course, in Canada, at least, as well as in the United States and many other countries, actually a few other countries, unfortunately, psychotherapy is not publicly funded. So the large majority of people can't actually afford to spend $200, $250, up to $500 or more an hour every week for a year to do the psychotherapy that will work to help them get through some of their struggles. Grief used to be listed as an exclusionary factor for depression, but it's no longer. With the release of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual 5th edition, which is the newest edition of essentially the Bible or the dictionary of mental health problems and illnesses for doctors. It always used to be that if the person is grieving, then they couldn't have depression because it's all what they're feeling is explained by the grief. However, that's no longer the case. We now know that you can both be grieving and have depression, and that those do seem to coexist. Addiction is a very high risk factor for depression and suicide directly, as well as attachment style. For example, people who've developed an avoidant or an ambivalent attachment style as a young child may not be as willing to ask for help because they never received a good response for asking for help in their life or in their childhood in the past. So that helps them to avoid asking for help in the future. Introverts, likewise, tend to put themselves out there less, so they're less likely that other people will notice that they're struggling. And comorbid mental illnesses, so depression is almost always present when there's almost any other mental illness as well. Depression is almost the starting point in many ways. Social factors, somebody could be isolated socially, and that could be feeding into their depression, as well as interpersonal conflict, major life events, work or school stress, social exclusion as well, as I've mentioned. Housing instability often isn't considered, but certainly in a campus context, if you're making the transition from residence or from home into the university, moving homes is one of the most stressful events in a person's life. And if you're living at home or if you're moving residences, often that's not seen as stressful, but it can be, because you're giving up your secure base and you need to reinvent yourself almost every year. Job and food security, certainly if you have a crushing student loan, or you're not sure how you're going to feed yourself or hold down a job, or you're trying to juggle both a job and class or school. And this applies equally to faculty as well, part-time faculty in particular. If you're trying your best just to meet the basic necessities of your life, it's not surprising why there's almost certainly higher rates of depression and anxiety among people who have that experience. So how do we get past that? How do we tear down that wall, both in ourselves? And I think anytime we want to change others, we need to start by changing ourselves. But we can use those skills that we apply to ourselves, we can start to apply them to others too. And 3 basic steps that I would recommend are to watch, to listen, and to act. So those 3 levels. When you're watching, you're listening to your gut. You're noticing in yourself, I'm just not feeling myself today, and I haven't been feeling myself for the last 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 3 months, 6 months, whatever it is. You know your baseline better than anybody else. You know how you usually are, and if you've departed from how you usually are, maybe there's something going on there. So you can ask yourself, what is the problem? If you're resisting going out with friends and you used to enjoy that, asking yourself, well, why has this been a pattern? What's the pattern that I've not been wanting to go out with my friends for dinner or to talk or to a coffee shop or whatever? Why haven't I been going out as much? And be curious, be a passive observer essentially of your experience. The same applies to watching somebody else as well. Listen to your gut. If you know that person, and I always recommend that you're looking out for people that you know versus those that you don't know so well, but listen to your gut. If you think that something's up, it doesn't hurt to ask. And we're going to talk a little bit about asking too. You can ask in yourself, what's the problem? Am I noticing something, or is this in me, or is this in them? That's worth asking too. But then to be curious, and I say curious, but not judgmental. We're not assuming that there's an illness, either in ourselves or somebody else. We're not a diagnostician, we're not a physician, or even if you are, you're probably too close to that person to make an accurate diagnosis anyway, especially without all the facts. So you can be curious, but not diagnostic. That's why we lead into the next step, listen. You need to notice very intentionally what's going on with some people and within yourself. If you have that gut, then you can start to pay a little bit closer attention. I mean, ideally, we're all paying close attention to others around us anyway, but assuming that we're not, starting to pay a little bit more attention to that person so you can get a better sense of what their baseline is, what motivates them, what inspires them, and what their struggles are, what they're dealing with. You can listen actively, and that means asking questions while you listen. You're not leading them or assuming. You're not saying, "So you're pretty depressed, eh?" Although that might be something that connects with that person. But you're asking questions that help to open up the conversation and build trust. You're not telling them what you want to hear. I hear this all the time with suicide prevention as well, where somebody who's genuinely afraid that perhaps their friend might be thinking about suicide, and they'll say, "You're not thinking about killing yourself, are you?" Well, you're telling them what to say. You're giving them an instruction that I'm not ready to talk to you about this, so don't tell me, but I know that I need to ask. So that's some of the unconscious messaging that gets communicated. And we have to be very careful that we do ask open and honest questions. You can ask them how to help. Often, especially if you're a friend, but even if you're a faculty member, a staff member, a casual observer, asking how you can help them is the key question. Rather than telling them what they need to do. Oh, you should do this, or you shouldn't do this. You shouldn't take medication because those are mind-bending drugs, or you shouldn't do yoga or just be a vegan. That's not going to cure your mental illness. There's all kinds of routes to recovery, and there's no one route. If it works for you, then you should pursue that with all passion and vigor. If it doesn't work for you, however, we also need to be able to identify that. Maybe you keep trying the same things that aren't working. We need to be able to respect people's boundaries in that respect, though, that they may not be ready to go and talk to their doctor yet. That's okay. Or to talk to their parents or to go to counseling. That's fine. We have to be able to respect that. because they have all their own reasons for that. But we can still encourage them to be able to talk to us. Also recognizing your own boundaries and being able to push yourself a little bit beyond them without risk of injury. You're not launching yourself way too far and overexposing yourself into emotional vulnerability, because you could get hurt, especially if you don't know how to come back out of it again. But being able to learn in small increments the best ways of what work for you can be very helpful. And then acting, especially when it comes to suicide, you're watching and you suspect that there might be something wrong. You're asking and you're listening. You're asking directly. I'm going to give you some more tips around suicide in particular in a second. But then you're taking the risk very seriously. We're not just saying, and I hear this all the time still, I've been hearing it for 15 years now, more than 15 years now, oh, that person is just doing this for attention. They're just threatening to kill themselves because they want the attention. Then give them the attention. I would rather give them attention than have that person die when they don't need to. So if that's all they need, then fine. We can connect in. If that person's feeling so isolated, so crushed, so alone that they think that this is their only option, then we can address that. Take risk seriously. If you're not, presumably you're not a therapist or a doctor, so you can't possibly take on or fix that person. We have to avoid, as I say here, fixer fixation, where we forget to be their friend and we instead think that we're there to fix them. You're not their doctor. Sometimes you need to remind them of that, and you need to remind yourself of that too. If the risk is so high that it's beyond your capability as a friend, as a colleague, a staff person or faculty member, then that's a medical emergency. If somebody's suicidal and you don't know what to do, or it's beyond your capacity to help, you still have to get somebody else to help. You wouldn't leave somebody who's having a heart attack lying to die in the hallway, and you wouldn't leave somebody who's suicidal either. They may not like you because of that. They may get very angry that you've had to call emergency services because they're suicidal. But really, quite frankly, and I strongly have believed this all my life, I'd rather somebody be angry with me than dead, because that's a trade-off that I'm simply not willing to take. Especially when we know that people not only can recover and live and thrive after they've been depressed, anxious, suicidal, whatever else, they can have wonderful lives after they get through that. So knowing your resources then too, not just 911 or whatever emergency services in your area, but knowing where your local community mental health organizations are, knowing where your hospitals are, if there are crisis lines or your campus has mental health services, having either knowing what they are or knowing where to send somebody to find them can be your best resource. So suicide risk, and there's a lot here. So you know, it's in a fairly commonly known, at least in the mental health world, acronym, a widely accepted acronym to break this down. But there's a lot, so try to stay with me. But the acronym that it breaks down to is path warm, a little mnemonic to try to remember. Is ideation. Is the person thinking or talking or threatening suicide? Do they have the idea of suicide in their head somewhere? And substance misuse. We know that if people either have been increasing their drinking, drug use, whatever their substance of choice is, and you can certainly go more broadly with that. You can look at if they're increased in their gambling behaviors or their sexual behaviors or pornography or shopping even. We look for increases or excessive of anything, since they could be markers. However, substance misuse in particular with drugs and alcohol is high risk, because a substantial portion of people who die by suicide, it's been found later that there are drugs or alcohol in their body. So we know that that's a significant risk. Path. So these are some of the things that people feel when we're worried that they are experiencing or at high suicide risk, which is purposelessness. You'll hear all the time that they have no reason to live, that there's no point. They're often very anxious. They can be overwhelmed, and they're not coping effectively with this storm of emotions that are inside them, which makes it very difficult to see to the other end of the forest if all you are trapped in are the trees. They're feeling trapped. They feel like that there's no way out of a situation, even if there are lots of other roads. Like I said near the beginning, you just don't see them. Your mind has closed those off as possibilities. And they feel hopeless. They're so zoomed in, calcified, and rigidly stuck in that place that they think that things will never get better. You have a very difficult time seeing the future if your present is so painful. Some of the other behaviors that you'll see, warm, people will withdraw. They avoid people often. They'll avoid activities that they normally liked. They might not go out with friends or family as much anymore. They may stop coming to class. They may not come to the same kind of clubs or school clubs or other sports or other activities that they used to enjoy. Anger is very common, and it seems to be closely connected with anxiety as well, particularly when it's uncontrolled and they're trying to express themselves, but they don't know how. They don't have the skills how. Recklessness becomes very common too. There almost seems to be this unconscious drive that if it's an accident, then it wasn't a suicide. So people, or they lose the same kind of sense of safety or the same desire for safety that they once had because they're suicidal. So things that they would have normally avoided, or ways that they would have normally kept themselves safer, they are less attentive to that. And certainly significant changes in mood on either end. They could become extremely depressed, and often you'll notice that, or extremely manic, elated, anxious. Significant swings along that spectrum that I showed you could be a risk of suicide as well. So how do you block that path, that pathway that people are going down towards suicide? And you almost always can, ideally by intervening early. So I have here the ideas of talk, trust, and track. Under talk, you're asking directly. That is the first most effective way to prevent suicide. Ask the person, are you thinking about killing yourself? Most people are super uncomfortable asking that question. I get it. What if they say yes? Then what do I do? I hear this all the time, that people don't want to ask because they're afraid if the person says yes, they don't know what to do. They're afraid that they might offend the person, or that it'll be awkward, or that the other person will get angry with them. Again, I'd rather all of those conditions at once versus the person be dead. So ask the person directly. They might say no, and they might be lying. That's okay. It means it's not a safe enough space for that person yet, and they've been told so many times not to talk about these issues that they're just not ready. That's too far of a leap and not gradual enough. However, it might be just the thing they need. They might break down right in front of you and say, yes, nobody's ever asked me before. And they might disclose. They might often, and this will happen too, be somewhere in the middle, where it's, I'm not sure, I think maybe, and they're probably testing you out. They're probably testing if you're a safe person or not. So pro tip, be a safe person. Preventing suicide starts with everybody. This is a societal public health problem, and if we're all safer people, then that goes a long way toward preventing suicide. You can talk with the person about depression, and likewise, I want to reiterate, this all applies to yourself too. You can ask yourself, am I suicidal? If the answer is yes, and you're going to play the same games with yourself too. You might avoid the question, you might not ask yourself, you might not face that in yourself, but ask yourself that question and then talk about depression. I wonder if I might be depressed. You can assess plans for suicide. High risk if a person has a defined plan. That is, say they know what they want to do, they know their method, know their means, they know where they want to go, they know the date. Maybe they have a note, although most people don't write a suicide note. If they have defined plans like that, that means they're already much further down the path, and that increases the risk pretty dramatically. But you're avoiding judgment. You're, as scary as it can be, do not judge the person. That's going to shut down the conversation. That's going to turn them off, and that's what's going to compromise your safety as a helper, as a friend, as a family member, as a colleague. So avoiding judgment, watching that emotion, being available to help, asking what you can do for help. Part of why I called the next one trust is that it takes a lot of trust, or at least faith, if that's what you want to call it, on behalf of both parties, the helper and the person getting the help, to be able to trust that intervening won't hurt, that it's not going to make things worse. So screening, routine screening is definitely a best practice, knowing who's at risk for suicide and screening for that. However, suicide screening, mental health screening will come up, guaranteed, with lots of false positives. Lots of people will screen as suicidal who probably aren't, who at least don't have any immediate risk. However, that means that's what screening is, of course, to filter it to that level, and then start doing more meaningful connection with people, more clinical or peer support oriented interventions. And these can easily be done on college campuses. You know the people, you know who you're bringing into your college, of course, so being able to screen effectively. One huge red flag here, though, mental health screening, suicide screening is not a precondition for being a student. It's not a precondition for being allowed to stay in residence. We've heard too many of these stories where people have been kicked out of residence, kicked out of classes, suspended or expelled or otherwise removed from their university because they're at high risk for suicide. That is literally the most awful thing that a university or college campus could do. It will not help. In fact, it puts that person at significantly higher risk. And there's a shifting legal landscape in many countries whereby that college, university, employer, or whatever might be held legally accountable if something happens to that person for psychological injury inflicted on people. The courts are starting to change in their view of that. It takes a lot of trust to bring yourself or to encourage somebody else to enter into treatment. Cognitive behavioral therapy and dialectical behavior therapy are two of the most effective methods by which we can help people who have suicidal thoughts. Because in many ways, you get into a habit of thinking in a suicidal way, and both of these therapies can help with that. Building connections to the community and within the community, building a sense of purpose. One of the things that helped me recover from my own suicidal patterns, my own depression, was gaining a sense of purpose that I wanted to help educate other people on these issues. I wanted to, a stranger saved my life, and I wanted to be the stranger for others, and finding that purpose is what gave me a reason to live. Being able to accommodate, however, people where they are, you have to meet people where they are, and you're probably going to need ongoing help, ongoing counseling. It's not a one session, one size fits all kind of thing. So being able to work with that is key on a campus environment, especially. Tracking, so checking in with other people, just seeing if they need an extra hand, not doing it to make sure they're doing what you think they're supposed to be doing, but just checking in to say, hey, I know that you're having a hard time, just want to check in and see if you're doing okay. Likewise, checking in with yourself. You know, it's been 2 weeks, having a few minutes to pause and reflect and see how you're doing, see if you're getting closer back to your baseline, or if you need to make some adjustments. Recovery also takes a lot of patience too, though, and I'll remind you of that. That's why it's important to have crisis planning in place and people who can help with that on your campus, as well as ongoing support and postvention or support for people who have attempted. Suicide attempts are traumatic. People often experience PTSD as a result of a suicide attempt, and suicide attempt survivors are more likely to attempt again in the future, especially if they don't get the kind of postvention and help that they need after. So the last thing that I'll give to you today, because I'm just watching the clock here, on how to build a suicide-safe campus, or at least how to start leaning in that direction. Most campuses either have or have access to a health center of some kind, or physician, a campus doctor of some kind, hopefully more than one. But ideally, either if you don't have one, it's an investment to have one for sure. If you're a small school that doesn't have access to a physician, get one and make it a priority. And if you do, presuming that you do, make sure that active steps are taken to train that physician in stigma reduction and then asking the right questions for people who are suicidal. The healthcare system, this is consistently reported, tends to be the most stigmatizing against people with mental illnesses. And it's because people see it a lot, and they often have very old school beliefs about psychiatry, about mental health problems and illnesses. So we know that we need to give additional training to physicians and helpers to help break down that stigma. Ideally, if you're able to provide access to or hire psychiatry on campus, that's one piece of recovery, but don't expect that you send somebody to the psychiatrist and that will make them better. There's a much broader picture than that. Monitoring your health plan, or if you have an EAP equivalent, like a student support plan, for example, monitoring the usage. If you notice that people are using their psychology benefits more, their social work or counseling benefits more, it's worth considering increasing those as well. For example, Starbucks Canada, for all of their employees, full and part-time, now offer a $5,000 annual benefit to Starbucks baristas, Starbucks employees and their families, specifically for counseling. They offer benefits for other things as well, but $5,000 a year for counseling. Manulife Canada announced last summer that they're doing $10,000. If your students had access to $10,000 a year in essentially free psychotherapy, I guarantee you that would move the needle on depression and suicide on your campuses. Mentally speaking, or in terms of psychologically speaking, making sure that your psychological support teams or your mental health supports that you have on your campus are interdisciplinary. I think that's key. Having psychology and psychologists represented is great. They are very highly trained at what they do, but they also have one particular perspective, like all professions do. So that's why it's also important to introduce social workers as well, who have a bit of a different approach. occupational therapists who are sometimes not seen as being part of the mental health spectrum, but they are for sure in terms of getting a better understanding of what you're doing with your day-to-day life and how you spend your time. Psychotherapy, who may or may not be either psychologists or social workers, they could be some other professional designation, but ensuring that they are appropriately trained. Not every province or state has regulation around what it means to be a psychotherapist, so making sure that they're adequately and professionally trained. Psychiatric nursing, psychiatric nurses can pay more attention to often the biological side, or if they have community or public health nursing as well. And peer supporters as well. This is an emerging trend. Having a peer support program at your campus can be key to involving people with lived experience. You can consider developing courses, either full-term curricula that are informed by CBT and its practice, as well as mindfulness and self-care skills, or even just offering weekend classes, mental health first aid, assist training I mentioned here, applied suicide intervention skills training, mindfulness courses, even if they're just 2 days or a week or 6-week courses, giving people the opportunity to do that, and ideally letting them include it in their tuition as well, so that way finances aren't an issue. Training staff, faculty, and student leaders in particular, especially residence life staff and assist, applied suicide intervention skills training to teach them how to have these conversations and to help people who are at high risk, who are actively suicidal. And identifying restricting means and providing connection points. So if you have a bridge, for example, near or on your campus, ensuring that there's suicide prevention barrier on that bridge. Or roofs that have access, stairway or ladder access, ensuring that there's barriers or suicide prevention mechanisms there. Access to chemicals and poisons. All of these things can be assessed and identified for what's at high risk. If there are guns for some reason on or near your campus, all of these things can increase risk of suicide. If people have access to means, sometimes they'll use them. Likewise, for connection points, having phones, crisis lines, signs that give people the number to a crisis line, reminders that there is help and hope available. And committing to a mentally healthy campus culture is key. If people are too afraid to speak up and ask for help, then they won't, and they'll suffer. This is especially true for sports teams and male-dominated aspects and faculties of your campus, reminding people that it's not only okay to ask for help, it's expected, and that's what's going to increase your performance. Mentally, socially, academically, physically, professionally, and otherwise. If you have a mentally healthy campus culture, just like in most workplaces, you'll see benefits across the board.
Okay. Hey, Mark.
So I just want to leave you with, yep.
Oh, sorry, we just have a couple questions rolling in. It sounded like you were wrapping up. Angie's got a great question about the significance of mental health counseling and just why you find, in your opinion, that the administrative teams can sometimes invalidate the importance of counseling and just strategies that you maybe be able to provide us.
Yeah, so often the invalidation of mental health experiences, I'm going to minimize my screen here and go back to my thing. There we go. Often the invalidation comes from a place of stigma, of discomfort in that individual person themselves. So they don't think that it's a legitimate thing, or they're paying lip service to the fact that mental health is very trendy right now. Everybody's talking about mental health, but they're not actually implementing real strategies, or they're prioritizing other things over the psychological health and safety of their campus and of their student. That's where advocacy becomes key. Student organizations, student unions and associations needed to speak up, faculty associations, that on the faculty and staff side, psychological health and safety is a right. It's included in every single occupational health and safety code in Canada, most in the US, that if people are at risk psychologically, then they're at risk physically. So that needs to be treated that way. And likewise for the student body, this is your full-time job. You spend more time being a student than anything else when you're in that place. So I don't think that campus administrators yet fully appreciate this. And we're in an exciting place in mental health right now, where people have thought the same old stigmatizing, awful way about mental health problems and illnesses for all of human history, and it's just changing right now. That we're literally right on the verge between two generations, one of which doesn't understand mental health problems and illnesses very well, although many people are trying, and on the other side, millennials and younger that understand it much better. And we see this in the data too. Millennials and younger are far more likely to open up about their experiences and to ask for and seek help. So we need to make sure that that help is available.
Absolutely. We got a question from Brooke. Where do you think the idea that talking about suicide causes suicide comes from? Is it the fear of a chain of suicides?
Good question. So I think the initial fear is just that we didn't talk about suicide at all. So we didn't want to. But then this idea of the suicide contagion began to become more popular in the early 70s. And there is something to it. There does seem to be an effect, the suicide contagion effect or a suicide cluster, whereby if suicide is reported inappropriately in media, for example, or if risk factors are highlighted, if it's reported dangerously, and not just a triggering way, because we throw around the triggering a lot, and there's nothing necessarily wrong with triggering these thoughts. It's when there's no supports, there's no supports left for the person or offered to the person. So this was one of the primary concerns with the Netflix series 13 Reasons Why, that it's very graphic. It provides in-depth detail, essentially about how to kill yourself. That is extremely high risk. It's in every media guideline in the world, pretty much, around reporting and featuring suicide and talking about suicide, that these are high risk depictions of this issue, and that it does increase risk of suicide. And what we've seen since, of course, unfortunately and tragically, is that a number of young people have killed themselves and have left behind series of tapes or a series of, something that seems to be, that suggests that they've watched this series. The ultimate tragedy of that, of course, is that we knew that this would happen and that we said that this would happen. So I think that that's part of the fear, is that people have taken that idea of the suicide contagion and they've overgeneralized it. However, we also know that when you don't talk about suicide at all, it builds shame. It stops people from being willing to engage in what's called help-seeking behavior. If they believe so deeply that it's bad to talk about suicide, then they won't, which means that they won't ask for help. So we need to talk about suicide, but we need to do it in a healthy, productive, and safe way.
Absolutely. And then Jordan, who is watching from an Uber somewhere, is saying, what is the one thing that you wish more college admins knew about the reality of mental health care?
Well, I think quite simply, the reality is that there is no health without mental health, that this idea is so long past that there is the mind and the body as though they don't have anything to do with each other, or that this stuff is all in your head, just a product of your brain, or that it's all just behavioral, just a product of your choices. The fact is that it's none of those things exclusively, that you can give somebody all the medication they want for their depression and they might still be depressed, or they can have all the counseling in the world, but there's just something because of the pattern that they've had ingrained in them from childhood, that their brain has formed such a neural pathway that it's keeping them depressed. So I think that only focusing on one area or another, and this has been a very political field for a very long time, psychiatry has struggled for credibility for almost all of its existence, and it's a relatively new profession, believe it or not. So I think that that's been key. People have been so focused on their opinion of what mental health is that they've ignored a more holistic view, and we know that more holistic view is what helps people. When you can help people in their in the physiological sense, the biological sense with their struggles, also help them with their thinking, and also help them with their environment. We can cover all three bases. Recovery is almost certain in most cases.
Wonderful. Well, I think we're just about out of time, but I want to say thanks so much for coming on. We really appreciate it. Everyone in the chat, give Mark a big thank you. It's been great having you. Is there anything else you want to let everyone know before we let you go?
Well, thank you for having me. You can certainly follow me on Twitter at Mark Henick, MarkHenick. You can also visit my website, markhenick.com, where I regularly speak and share information that I feel is relevant to mental health and mental wellness.
Wonderful. We are also going to have a big post with all of Mark's information, including his website, his social media, the TED Talk that we mentioned at the beginning, and you'll be able to keep up with all that's happening. So once again, thanks so much, Mark.
Thank you all.
All right, take care.
Bye-bye.
Okay, guys, so stick around for just a couple more minutes because I have some exciting news. We've sort of been hinting at it on the social media, but as you know, we've been partnered with Post Secret for a couple months now, and we've been working on some big things, one of which is the Post Secret Campus Ambassadors Program, which is designed to help you guys bring such a big event to campuses If you want more details, I will put the link in the chat and you can check that out. But more recently, we've come up with this great new thing that's happening tomorrow. And right now, nobody knows but you guys. And it is an actual Q&A with Frank Warren himself. It's going to be right here on Crowdcast. I will send you guys the links and all of that. But the one stipulation is that you have to be a part of the Post-Secret Campus Ambassador Program or the Brave Campus online Facebook community. So if you guys have just registered for this webinar and you don't know what either of those things are, I'll give you a brief rundown. The Brave Campus community is a Facebook group where if you're part of the webinars and if you've been keeping up with Disrupt, you're more than welcome to join in. And it's serving as a place for all campus leaders to come together and just kind of solve the problems that we're all facing separately, but with the support of this new group. So you're more than willing to share resources, ask questions, look for ideas, help each other out, all of that. There's a button right now on your screen if you scroll down that says join the Facebook group. Again, I'll link it. So you have to be a part of that or be a part of the Ambassador Program. So this webinar is happening tomorrow at 2 p.m. Eastern. I will send you guys all of the information and we really hope to see you there. Next week on Webinar Wednesdays, we're going to have Megan Rayfuse. She's going to be doing a talk all about consent on campus. So how to approach it, how to explain it, how to bring attention to it. It's great for orientation weeks and all that kind of stuff. So we can't wait to see you there. I'm going to leave the chat open just for a little bit to put all this information in. If you have any questions, email me at callie@disrupt.com. And as always, we're always here to listen, talk if you need anything at all. So hopefully we'll see you in the Facebook group. Bye, guys.